Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in a few minutes as people are joining us. So bear with me. What we are going to do is have people, as they're entering throughout the presentation, if there are questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box, and we will get started probably a little bit after 3. So for those of you who are joining, welcome to today's presentation. We're just going to give it a few more minutes while people join in. We had a great deal of interest in today's presentation, so just bear with us, and we will be starting shortly. So we'll give it 2 more minutes, and we'll get started.
Just let me know, Kathy, when you're ready for me to go, okay?
Oops. Let's give it 1 more minute and we'll get started. People are continuing to join in. All right, why don't we get started?
Okay. Well, I think we're ready to go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Shannard Coongers. I am chair of the NASCA Education Committee, and I'll be hosting this afternoon's webinar. Thank you for joining us for this very interesting topic. You may have heard about a citizen's petition, which has been issued to the FDA regarding rescheduling or scheduling gabapentin and Acurbyl. This is pretty important to NASCA and our member states who have seen abusive behavior or diversion with gabapentin. I think we'll talk a little bit about tramadol as well. But first, before I introduce our speaker, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Everyone will be on mute during the presentation. If you have questions of the presenter, utilize the Q&A or the chat box on your screen. If you think of the question for the speakers at any point, just type it in. And Kathy Keogh will be monitoring for questions. If they're very pertinent to something that was just said, she may interrupt the speaker or will hold those for the discussion portion at the end of the event. If a question is more involved, we may unmute you so you can actually ask the question directly. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share this recording as well as today's PowerPoint presentation later this afternoon. We also invite your comments and questions and ask that you complete a brief survey at the conclusion of today's presentation, which you will receive via email. Today's webinar and all of our webinars that we host throughout the year could not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. They are Platinum sponsors Bamboo Health, Indivior, Johnson & Johnson Services, MD Scripts, and Tyler Technologies. Our gold sponsors are Jazz Pharmaceuticals, formerly Greenwich Biosciences, and silver sponsors Cardinal Health, Hyman Phelps and McNamara, Independent Pharmacy Cooperative, IQVIA, McKesson, Pharma Solutions USA Inc., Rite Aid Corporation, and ScriptSafe Inc. Thank you to our sponsors. A few important announcements. Mark your calendars. This year's annual conference will take place October 24th through 27 at the Marriott Salt Lake City Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. Should be an exciting meeting. Check the website for periodic updates. Dues notices will be sent out later next month, and be on the lookout for those so they can be paid promptly. Check out our latest NASCA podcast, The Pez Case. It is a lamb and the near death of 2 children on Podbean, Spotify. I believe it's on our website as well and other podcast platforms. It is extremely interesting. The Bylaws Resolutions Committee is seeking your suggestions for resolution ideas and bylaws changes. Check your state's contact info to ensure that it is accurate and up to date on the state profiles section of the website, and email Kathy Keogh with any updates or corrections. Please see the upcoming webinars on this slide and on our website. In April, we'll have Kay Doyle from Greenwich Biosciences talking about everyone's favorite topic, cannabis. Today, where are we now? In June, we'll have Pharma Solutions presenting on the proposed DEA suspicious order monitoring rule changes expected in 2022. A link to the registration is listed here as well. Okay, whoop. Now, finally, I can introduce today's presenter. We are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Michael Abrams, Senior Health Researcher, Health Research Group at Public Citizen, speaking to us today. Michael Abrams is a senior researcher in Public Citizen's Health Research Group, focusing on behavioral health, drug and device safety and efficacy, occupational safety and health, and broader health policy issues. He has over 25 years of clinical and governance research experience in the health sciences and more than 35 peer-reviewed publications. He is especially skilled as a health services researcher focused upon brain-based illnesses, including psychiatric diseases such as schizophrenia and depression, addictions such as opioid and alcohol use disorders, and degenerative or neurodevelopmental diseases such as dementia and autism. Modalities of health science research Michael has contributed to include behavioral genetics, MRI structural and functional brain imaging, and large administrative data analytics. He has also served as the Director of Studies and Consensus Activities pertaining to national healthcare strategies at both the National Academy of Sciences and the National Quality Forum. And he is especially knowledgeable about the U.S. Medicaid program. Michael has an MPH from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a PhD in health policy from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Dr. Abrams, we are very honored to have you with us today. The floor is yours to start today's presentation.
Thank you. Can I be heard okay?
Yes, you sound wonderful.
Okay, good. Let me share my slides and begin here. Can you see my slides? Oops. Now you should be able to see my slides.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for that nice welcome and for having me today. I really appreciate it. This particular group is an important focus of what I'm going to be spending most of my time speaking about. So I'm Michael Abrams from Public Citizen. And this afternoon, I'm going to tell you about our petition, especially focused on gabapentin and gabapentin enocarbil. But first, I'll give you a little bit of a background about my organization and especially on our health-related work we do so that you can have a full context of our efforts and further appreciate the fact that we are an independent and very steadfast actor regarding federal healthcare policies, especially including some that involve scheduling medications, which is the main topic of today. So now you should be looking at my slide number 2. Public Citizen was founded 50 years ago by now. And I think it's fair to say that it was founded by a gentleman named Ralph Nader. I think it's fair to say now that he is a legendary consumer advocate and lawyer. Mr. Nader is a very compelling figure whose long career is still ongoing, although he's retired from Public Citizen, and his work has included major actions on things like automobile and other consumer product safety, including prescription medications, those pertaining to prescription medications. Anyways, if you haven't heard of him, he's run for president a couple of times as well. If you haven't heard of him, he's certainly worthy of your research time, I would say. Lots has been written about him and written by him. A few details about our organization, our ethos, if you will, are summarized on the bottom of this slide. We are a consumer advocacy and public interest group, not-for-profit, nonpartisan, fiercely independent. I had listed on my initial slide that I have no conflicts, and that is completely by design. So even though you all receive sponsorship from pharmaceutical companies, for example, I do not. I do not have any securities or any conflicts related to this kind of presentation or this kind of work. Other details about our group, we have about 500,000 members and supporters currently, and our efforts can broadly be described as pertaining to the broad swath of issues related to protecting democracy and good governance, consumer and worker safety, which I do a little bit of work in, healthcare, of course, which is the focus of my work and what I'll be talking about principally today. We do work on global trade, climate and energy, and justice in the courts as well. And just to give you a few quick examples, this slide shows that we tend to work on the federal level almost exclusively. And at the highest levels of government, we're an organization that does not shy away from action that might reveal the proverbial emperor, or in this case, the president, or his advisors and supporters has no clothes, or at least has poor legal arguments. And I show this slide in particular to show you that Public Citizen has been around for a long time. We have a long memory. We're quite tenacious in revealing and using the truth to create positive change. As you heard, my advanced terminal degrees are in public health and health policy, and I have many years experience in clinical research and big data analytics and so forth. But many of my colleagues are lawyers, and in fact, among the most exhilarating aspects of my work culture is the fact that I have access to such expertise, germane to this petition, in fact, and I'll talk about that later. And many of my colleagues, in fact, have argued cases before the highest court in the land. I think Public Citizen to date has argued something like 40+ cases before the Supreme Court. Here's a picture of my colleagues in 2010 at a case that was argued there. And the far left is my colleague Scott Nelson. And he just last week argued a case before the Supreme Court that involved workers' rights and their right to sue their employer when bad things happen in the workplace. And a little bit more on workers' rights in a moment, because it's part of our healthcare portfolio. Sometimes we even get a close-up seat at the legislative table. As I said, we're fiercely independent and nonpartisan, but in this case, back in 2012, my colleagues were deeply involved in negotiations that led to insider trading restrictions for members of Congress, an issue that unfortunately has in a slightly different form been revisited now because of questionable congressional profit taking, which occurred at the outset of the COVID epidemic, right? So this is an issue that that we've addressed before and we continue to address. Here I've, on this slide, I've circled for you my president, the president of Public Citizen, Robert Weissman. In the center, of course, is President Obama signing that legislation about controlling stock trades by members of Congress. Though, as I said, we are nonpartisan, we do this kind of work regularly and try to directly influence policy when we can. In this case, we definitively help move the needle in that regard, and we're very involved, as evidenced by the position of our president to the actual president. My colleagues do a lot of work on the environmental issues. For example, just today we released a report detailing that the fossil fuel industry very recently executed stock buybacks in excess of $45 billion. That's billion with a B. The point of this report for us, and we think should be for others, is that despite messages that you get from large corporations, especially fossil fuel corporations in this case, we are not feeling sorry for these industries, and we are working hard as a regular part of our portfolio to supplant their dominance, their fossil fuel dominance with cleaner sources of energy. So let's get on specifically to healthcare. And the first bullet is actually a segue from the last one, because some of the work that we do involves things like, that would be characterized as climate issues. So, and that's simply because climate change, clean water, et cetera, has marked impact on health. So not infrequently, our health research group will at least write about, if not collaborate with, other members of our staff who are focused on climate change issues. But more specifically to healthcare, and this slide sort of summarizes our healthcare portfolio. The second bullet there refers to our Access to Medicine team, a very active effort at Public Citizen, conducts research and advocacy surrounding issues of the affordability and the availability of the best medications. Lately, the group especially has done a lot of work on COVID vaccines and treatments, as you probably suspected, including efforts to encourage proper federal action to make antiviral drugs available and affordable, and especially to make the mRNA vaccines and the recipe available and affordable to the world. We've been pushing hard for that. We continue to do that. We feel it's a matter of not just wise humanitarian, but also strategic, geopolitical strategic action. Regarding healthcare funding more generally, Public Citizen has long been a steadfast supporter of affordable universal healthcare. The current thrust of which is expanding Medicare as broadly as possible, because we believe, and as do many, that there's a lot of data suggesting that folks either lack access vis-a-vis the private and Medicaid offerings that are available, that we think, and again, others think are woefully insufficient. And simultaneously, for example, we're working to get expansions even to Medicare that include things like dental, vision, and health benefits that currently are not covered by that important healthcare program for the elderly and for the disabled. As noted, per my brief mention of the Supreme Court and the executive branch, we have deep legal experience to keep an eye on Congress and most federal agencies as necessary, right? So we have a Congress Watch team that does more on the legislative side, and a litigation team that's more involved with the courts. And you know, again, is expertise that I draw on, for example, when I draft a petition such as the one I'm going to be focusing most of my time on today. I'm part of the health research group. Let me tell you briefly about us and what our focus is. The group was founded in 1971, the same time as Public Citizen was founded by Dr. Sidney Wolfe. And I'm pleased to say he still works with us as a senior advisor. He's also a legend, I would say, like Ralph Nader is. Also, Dr. Mike Carome is our current division director. Both of these distinguished gentlemen I should mention specifically here because they're physicians, right? Prescriber training and experience, unlike me. I'm a doctor, but I can't write prescriptions, right? But they can and have. And those two gentlemen not only lead our health research group on a daily basis, they encourage me to and help me craft this petition that I'm going to be talking about and telling you about. And they are co-signers of the petition along with me. Broadly, the bottom bullet list on this slide summarizes the work that the HRG does. Our overall mission is to advance this safe and effective and the safety and effectiveness of clinical medicine, right? Very much targeted on clinical Western medicine in the US, including sound regulation and appropriate use of prescription medications is a strong focus. We especially keep a close eye on the FDA and the HHS and related agencies, a few listed here. We often testify at the FDA advisory committee meetings for controversial new drug applications. As just one example, I can tell you that last week I testified in opposition to a drug that the sponsor claims is a safe and effective treatment for ALS, right? Lou Gehrig's disease. That was a rather gut-wrenching experience for me. My rather dispassionate statistical testimony was sandwiched between that of patients. There's huge need for treatments for that terrible and deadly disease. But in this case, we thought that the evidence was poor for this new medicine, and the only thing that makes us more sad and angry at a disease without a cure is one where people are trying to market a remedy that isn't ready for prime time. And so we testified in opposition to that. Fortunately, I can say with regard to that particular medication, the expert advisory committee has sided, as did many of the FDA staffers, sided with our concerns about the medicine. We, of course, also do petitions to schedule and reschedule drugs, which is what I'm going to be focusing on from here on out. And we do that when appropriate. Along with our litigation group, I want you to be aware too that we track health and worker health and safety. Two examples of that are germane to the age that we live in right now involve COVID safety in the workplace. We've been working on commenting on rules issued by the Occupational Safety Health Administration, and also heat stress standards, which pertain especially to farm workers working in the summer months, but to other workers as well, and has been complicated by the COVID situation. As you can imagine, combining PPE with a hot work environment is a challenge that workers in certain environments especially are faced with. Finally, I want to note for you that we do a lot of direct consumer education regarding pharmaceuticals and broad healthcare issues, and we do that in at least two forms. We aptly and simply name one of those outreach efforts as our Worst Pills, Best Pills newsletter. And we also have a website companion that goes with that. And the second effort that we do also monthly is we craft a online blog or health, what we call our health letter. And I'll just give you a sense of that health letter on this slide to give you a sense of the topics that are in there. And this is actually directly from our website. As I say, this is freely available to folks. Recent headlines include lay-directed information about things like in March, the shingles vaccine, or in February, routine screening for colorectal cancer, or even things related more generally to public health issues. In January, I specifically wrote about alcohol and its relationship to as a carcinogen and cancer-causing agent. So we try to educate the public and do so in a straightforward fashion. We also, as I said, we have a website and a companion newsletter entitled Worst Pills, Best Pills, which allows subscribers, and for a nominal fee, it's like $10 a year or something like that to cover our costs. Subscribers can look up drugs, diseases or side effects, or general keywords and find out information about commonly used prescription drugs and get some expert insights from us, which we think helps people deal with the cornucopia of medications that exist out there. Here's an example of our print newsletter, and you can see the kinds of topics that we cover. They might involve, if you look on the right-hand side of the slide here, medications that cause diarrhea as a information opportunity. And then I've circled a topic I thought you might be particularly involved in, CBD oil treatment. And in this case, it was actually an article that I drafted that reviewed a study indicating that CBD oil is not effective, unfortunately, as a treatment for arthritic pain. So we spend a lot of time educating folks, in addition to being, if you will, a watchdog for the FDA and HHS, as well as we operate, as our health research group operates. Now, before I talk about the Gabapentin petition, I wanted to briefly mention our Tramadol petition to give you a sense and to alert you that this exists, and to give you a sense of sort of what the timelines are that we look at when we file these kinds of actions. So this petition actually was filed before I came to Public Citizen. It was in 2019. I've been there almost 2 years. Filed November 6, 2019. This was not to schedule the drug per se. It was to change the scheduling from 4 to Schedule 2, and I'll talk a bit more about that too, but I suspect this audience is quite familiar with what that means. We think tramadol, which is an opioid, should be scheduled with other opioids like oxycodone, for example. Currently it's not, and we think that that's inappropriate regulation of its risk, and so we've petitioned the FDA and also the DEA to change that scheduling. Submitted in 2019, we received almost immediately an acknowledgement letter. We've received also an interim response from the agency saying that it's too complicated for them to have ruled on it yet. We've also submitted some supplemental data as well to try to further things along. There's a link to our Tramadol petition at the bottom of the slide. If you're interested, you can go to our website and just search for Tramadol and you'll be able to find it. If the FDA and the DEA don't act soon, then we may well resort to filing a lawsuit to get them to do what they need to do, which is to, in some form, respond to our petition. Of course, we hope that that response will be proceedings and eventually ruling that we were correct and this drug should be scrutinized more carefully than it currently is. So stay tuned on that. So now let me turn to the Gabapentin petition specifically. The aim here is to schedule gabapentin, and gabapentin gabapentin enacarbil, the prodrug of gabapentin, for the first time, because it's not currently scheduled per the Controlled Substance Act. Some of the pertinent statutes and regulations are cited on this slide that we go to in order to make our arguments. Also at the bottom of the slide is the docket number that was created when we submitted our petition to the FDA via regulations.gov. We have formally teed up this petition as of February 9th. It's been received. We've received acknowledgement both from the DEA and the FDA that they have it in their hands. What I'm going to do today for you is to give you a background sketch of the arguments that we made related to that petition. The form of these are fairly straightforward, and hopefully you'll see fairly linear in terms of the way that we make our case for why we think this is important action for the DEA and the FDA to take. Background and scheduling for this group, you all are no doubt all too familiar with this, but just as a reminder, uniquely dangerous drugs are scheduled vis-a-vis the Controlled Substance Act into 5 categories from, the highest, right, LSD, heroin, et cetera, on Schedule 1 to the lowest on Schedule 5. Schedule 5, that's the target for gabapentin, right, for our petition. Examples of Schedule 5 are listed on the bottom of that slide, the cough medicine Robitussin, the anti-diarrheal drug Lomotil, to give you some idea of what we're talking about. And notably, that last drug, brand name Lyrica, generic name pregabalin, is a GABAergic molecule, very similar to gabapentin, and more about that in a moment, but we think that strengthens our case for scheduling gabapentin, because pregabalin has, since its approval, its FDA approval in 2005, has been scheduled. So in order to schedule a drug, the DEA has criteria, and our petition lists these criteria explicitly and then tries to make arguments that indicate how that criteria is met with regard to gabapentin. There are 4 major points of interest. The first is that the drug in question needs to be used in sufficient amounts to create a hazard. The second is that there must be significant diversion, that is from its intended medical use. The third is that there must be self-administration, right? Volition by the individual rather than them taking it based on medical advice, and that happens. So it's kind of related to diversion if you think about it, but still a separate criteria for the DEA guidance. And the fourth, which somewhat applies in this situation, but is at least partially relevant, for a new drug anyways, if another drug is already scheduled, that strengthens the case for the drug under consideration to be scheduled. In this case, gabapentin isn't new. 1993, it was approved. Pregabalin approved in 2005 and immediately scheduled. But because pregabalin is scheduled, and it looks like it, at least partially, we think even this 4th criteria is germane to our arguments. There's also the decision of which schedule to place things on, right, across the 5 levels. And DEA resource guide also refers to 8 things to consider here, so I'll just review them quickly with you. The relative potential for abuse matters, right? So a drug that's very alluring, very addictive would score high on that criteria, and so forth. Scientific evidence of pharmacological event, and related to that, number 3, the state of current knowledge of the substance. The drug's history and pattern of abuse being relevant. The scope, duration, and significance of that abuse, does it result in serious addiction? Does it often result in overdose and so forth? That would matter. The risk to public health, of course, these are somewhat related, but that's stated explicitly. And similarly, item 7, its dependence liability, also related to above, but stated explicitly. And then again, there comes again this precursor note to other substances. And remember, I told you that pregabalin is a prodrug to gabapentin, so that number 8th point is relevant. Again, this tells us which schedule to put the drug on. You know, the higher these are, the closer the more likely you're going to put it on Schedule 1. The lower these overall factors are, the more likely it would be on Schedule 5. Ultimately, fairly early in our research, we decided that it was reasonable to target gabapentin for Schedule 5. And here in the 3 bullets listed are our rationale, you know, again, based on DEA guidance for doing so. Gabapentin has low potential for abuse relative to substances on Schedule 4. And just as an example, I give you some examples of Schedule 4 medicines, for example, Valium. So, you know, part of what we're acknowledging is that gabapentin is a problem, but and that needs to be scheduled, but not as big a problem as, for example, Valium. And so we're okay putting it on Schedule 5 as opposed to saying having chosen Schedule 4. The drug gabapentin has currently accepted medical use in the treatment in the US. That is clearly the case. Gabapentin, more on that later, but there are certainly approved indications that's widely used in the US and elsewhere by the medical community. And that 3rd bullet, abuse of the drug may lead to limited physical dependence or psychological dependence relative to drugs or other substances. Again, we're acknowledging that gabapentin has these concerns, but it's more limited than, say, you would see with Xanax or Valium. Thus, again, our choice to push for Schedule 5 as opposed to higher schedules. This slide is just, I'm simply showing you, and we proffer it in the petition to demonstrate how similar both gabapentin and its prodrug, gabapentin and acarbryl, in the center panel there, is to its prodrug pregabalin. Remember again that despite the similarities between these 3 chemically, now we're talking about, only the 3rd column on that on this slide represents a drug that's scheduled by the Drug Enforcement Administration right now. So a little bit more background on what's known about these molecules, and there's a lot that's not known actually, but it is known that they are structurally related to the naturally occurring inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA, but curiously, no effect on GABA binding, uptake, or degradation. So there's a lot that's not understood about the biochemistry of this. As I said, an acarbryl form is a prodrug of gabapentin. The exact mechanism of action of this drug's ability to treat pain, the 2 main indications, generally speaking, are pain, analgesia, and epilepsy as an anti-epileptic effect, that is treating seizures. The mechanism of action is not known. You know, in vitro studies, you know, Petri dish studies suggest high affinity for calcium channels, presumably involved in the reaction potential of the nerves. In rat brain studies, there's binding that's demonstrated in the higher components of the cortex of the rat, right? The neocortex and even the hippocampus, known to be involved in and memory and other related cognitive, functions. So that's suggestive of its importance, the importance of these drugs of acting in the central nervous system. There's also data to suggest that it's involved in that these kinds of drugs are involved in excitatory synapse formation, right? So communications between synapses, you can see how it might be related then to controlling seizures, which is an overactivity of those kinds of cells. And sort of the therapeutic effects that have been hypothesized is that new synapse formation is somehow regulated by these medications. But there's a lot that's left to be desired about fully understanding how these drugs work. Here on this slide, I'm listing for you the FDA approved indications, right? The legitimate indications for these drugs for gabapentin and its brand Neurontin, approved in 93 for seizures in adults, later approved for seizures in children, also approved for the pain syndrome that follows the shingles infection, post-traumatic neuralgia in adults. By comparison, gabapentin and anacarbil approved in 2011 for a condition known as restless leg syndrome, and for moderate to severe forms of that syndrome, I believe. And later for, again, for post-traumatic neuralgia, just like gabapentin. And then finally, pregabalin approved in 2005, as I said, and immediately scheduled, has additional indications in the pain domain, diabetic, neuropathic pain, fibromyalgia, pardon me, and also pain associated with spinal cord injury. But sort of general themes are seizure medicine and later adapted for pain issues. So these are the approved indications. Currently, it's not scheduled at the federal level, but it is scheduled in the 7 states that are listed here in bold on the top of this slide. And 12 more states actually do PDMP drug monitoring related to anacarbil. Moreover, I can tell you that in the United Kingdom, just in 2019, despite the long history of gabapentin in particular, gabapentin and pregabalin were placed in the United Kingdom on their controlled substance list, so as to give that country and its National Health Service the ability to limit the number of days prescribed for a given prescription and the length of the validity of prescription, among other regulatory measures that they use for their controlled substances there. So now let me talk a bit about why we're concerned and how what I do basically on the next few slides is grab some of the pieces of evidence and describe to you some of the pieces of evidence that we use to argue that we think gabapentin is of concern, and they follow along from the criteria that I described to you at the beginning, that the DEA guidance puts forth for this kind of action. So in the hazards to human health domain, it's very clear from the labels that there are some very serious hazards, things like suicidal ideation. That's relatively rare, but noted. Much less rare is the fact, and I will talk about this more, that respiratory depression is a concern with gabapentin, especially when it's combined with opioids. And of course, this audience knows all too well the consequences of that can be quite severe, even deadly. Label precautions also include the sort of sedative effects, effects that plausibly impact brain function and consciousness as well. And specifically, I note here that the labels describes studies in children for which there is some clinical trial evidence of increased risk of, first of all, exacerbating seizures, rather an ironic effect, but also of other important behavioral sequelae like moodiness, lability, overactivity, and aggressive behaviors. And in the bottom of the slide, I'm just showing you the rates of gabapentin versus placebo from those clinical trials demonstrating these kinds of concerns. So for example, the first row of that table shows you that 6% of individuals, children prescribed gabapentin for their seizures experience noticeable clinical lability. Only about 1/6 of that placebo. Those are marked differences that are certainly of relevance to prescribing physicians and the patients using this medicine. In this case, to kids being treated for seizure disorder. On this slide, I'm summarizing for you a December 2019 formal issuance of warning from the FDA, a so-called drug safety communication. The subject of this, for gabapentin specifically, the subject of this communication was concern about respiratory depression and making that better known to the prescribing community and to patients. Again, especially a concern in combination with opioids or other respiratory depressants, including things like antihistamines listed here. And also increased risk for people with respiratory illness, in this case, any kind of severe pulmonary disease is explicitly noted. The FDA issued this warning citing some FAERS data, that's the Federal Adverse Event Reporting System data, their passive surveillance system that tenders reports from around the world about medicines, and they database it, and they sometimes see signal. In this case, they saw deaths, they saw injuries related to gabapentin use that prompted them to issue this concern. They also reviewed some data. One of the studies that they reviewed that I think is particularly evocative and that we do refer to in the petition came from an Australian group headed by Pyovazin. And typically too, I will tell you that on my slides, I list the first author and the journal, as well as the year and issue number of publication if you want to follow up or fact check me from this presentation. That's how that's designed for you to do that. But this a small trial was nicely done as a crossover placebo-controlled trial. That is, people were blinded. So it actually was only 8 men, but as I say, they were blinded individuals, adult males, not obese, so presumably not concerned with sleep apnea per se coming in. And they were given a 300 milligram bedtime dose of gabapentin or a placebo, and then later crossed over randomly to the other condition. And what you're seeing on the right is just a juxtaposition of the placebo apnea hypoapnea index, that is number of events that suggest during their sleep that they were having trouble breathing, that there might be some respiratory depressant effect. And you can see quite clearly across all 8 subjects that there are increased rates of that kind of indication. Just sort of a nice, albeit small, trial demonstrating concerns you might have with this drug. Imagine if you combine it with alcohol or opioids, the concern no doubt is greater in that regard. More on respiratory depression on this slide, just briefly reviewing for you some studies that we cite. The top one followed 11,000, just almost 12,000 patients who received joint arthroplasty surgery, right? And just over 2,800 of them experienced, so fairly high number, right? Almost a third experienced respiratory depression events after their surgery. And gabapentin use over 300 milligrams preoperatively, as before the surgery to try to anticipate pain, was associated with higher respiratory depression versus just using general anesthesia alone. So pretty important, we think, clinical evidence, as did the FDA, of this respiratory depression effect of the medication. The middle study by Kozer and colleagues there comes from 2008 and looked at rabbits in this case. So this is actually not a clinical study, but an animal study. Gave the rabbits 4 daily doses of gabapentin and then later injected them with morphine and measured their blood CO2 concentration, a pretty good indication of respiratory difficulties. The higher CO2 is, the worse, right? You're not supposed to retain CO2 in your lungs, you're supposed to expire it. 10 to 30 minutes later, after that morphine injection, there were significant CO2 retention in the animals that received gabapentin, not in the animals that received the vehicle, or just an injection with saline. And finally, on that last slide, or the last bullet there, the Bykov study published in JAMA reviewed data from 2007 to 2017 on 5.5 million adults who underwent major surgery, and they found empirically 1.4 in 10,000 required a naloxone, right? A Narcan rescue prior to discharge, if they had received a gabapentin, either gabapentin or pregabalin, they were bundled together in this study, twice the rate of people who only received opioids to control their pain, okay? So again, evidence of this respiratory depression effect that we think is important and persuasive, and the FDA thought so too in 2019, enough at least to issue a public warning. The petition also talks about the fact that gabapentin is widely used off-label, that is for indications that are not approved by the FDA. Here, citing data from Zone colleagues from 2019, showing not only that nearly 100% of individuals use gabapentin, who are prescribed gabapentin, get it for an off-label indication, listed, several of them listed here. So 98.3% off-label use of all gabapentin prescriptions. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. They also trended things from 2003 to 2016. In 2003, adult medical visits, about 1% of all medical visits involved gabapentin. That's a high number just to start with. As of 2016, that number had more than tripled to almost 3% of all ambulatory adult medical visits. So it's hard to argue against the idea that gabapentin is not widely used by the medical community. It is widely used, both for on-label, but especially for off-label indications. That adds to our concern, of course. We reviewed several systematic reviews. I don't have time to go over all of them, but let me just advance. So they're listed here on the slide and sort of summarized in our petition. But let me just refer to a couple of these, and let me start actually with this one. This particular systematic review I thought was interesting and useful to include because the researchers used several specific characteristics to rank order, if you will, different substances regarding their concerns that one might have about hazard, diversion, self-administration, basically addictive or related behaviors. The characteristics they reviewed are listed in the middle of the slide, include things like physical and psychological dependence risk, severity of the addiction, whether or not rapid euphoria or overdose toxicity is high or otherwise with regard to each of the substances. And then down on the bottom of the slide, I give you sort of their bottom line. They tabulate this nicely in the article that we cite, and that's cited here. And they rank order these drugs, and you probably won't be too surprised about the rank order here. Opioids being the most addictive of all the substances reviewed, and then pregabalin and notably gabapentin, the least addictive risk associated with them. But pregabalin and gabapentin look an awful lot alike, and still convey with many of these concerns to enough of a level, especially when combined with opioids, that we think it's reasonable to continue to pursue scheduling of it.
Excuse me, I just wanted to give you, it's 10 of 4, so I just want to give you a pulse check.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy. Let me try to wrap up soon so we have some time for some questions. So a little bit more on systematic reviews. Let me just jump to this last one by Evoy and colleagues. They reviewed 55 explicit studies about opioid use disorder, related to gabapentin use, and in particular identified OUD as one of the, opioid use disorder is one of the greatest risk factors. That shouldn't be a concern. They also nicely demonstrate that concerns about physical dependence and withdrawal of symptoms, including, by the way, data from studies of newborns who've been exposed in utero to gabapentin and withdrawal symptoms that they experience. A little bit more on harms and the interaction that we see, especially with the co-administration of opioids. Adverse events, looking at adverse events, that is all-cause hospitalization as the outcome, and reviewing 800,000 adult patients from 2013 to 2016. This group, led by Peckham, found that high doses of gabapentin versus proper doses of gabapentin increased your risk of an inpatient hospitalization by 37%. Jump now to the final bullet on this slide. If you had in your record both high dose of gabapentin, relatively high doses of gabapentin, and high doses of overdose, in other words, both being overused, your increase was almost 10 times that amount. So a suggestion of an interaction, not surprising, but an important sort of dose response suggestion about the perniciousness of gabapentin, especially when it's combined with opioids. This slide shows one of the studies we cite from Finland, where they actually rank ordered the toxicity with an index referred to as an apt name, the fatal toxicity index. And you can see, and they ranked 70 of the most deadly drugs in their healthcare system using this kind of ranking. You can see things like methadone, oxycodone, very relatively deadly related to their overall consumption. Gabapentin, pregabalin, pretty similar. And down the list some, but still not too far from even things like codeine and fentanyl with regard to their overdose potential. This slide shows a study that we cite from the United Kingdom that demonstrates a pretty marked linear relationship between gabapentinoid use, both pregabalin or gabapentin, and the number of deaths that they see. And this is over a period from 2004 to 2015, where gabapentinoid prescriptions increased 10 times, from 1 million to 10 million prescriptions in the National Health Service, and deaths from essentially none, to 130 per year during that period. This slide is one of several studies that we cite about fatality signals that we see and that have been described in the literature. In this case, a 5-state study from 2015. Over 4,000 overdose toxicology reports reviewed, 22% of the decedents positive for gabapentin. Many of them, as the Venn diagram at the bottom shows, overlap with opioid exposure, but some of them unique to gabapentin exposure. And additional postmortem reports are described on this slide. The top bullet showing that the rates are between pregabalin and gabapentin are differential, but not when you add in the tramadol picture down at the bottom. There are percentages that are notable. This is actually a UK cohort that we're talking about, but notable rates of postmortem decedents testing positive for these substances. Here's a very recent report from the end of December, of last year, which is particularly evocative now because it looks at illicit manufactured fentanyl overdose, which, as you can see from the left-hand side of this slide, corresponds to almost half of all of the overdose deaths that we're seeing in the United States now. That is illicit fentanyl being the implicated substance in those. This is something you all know, but maybe what you didn't know is that about 5%, as shown in the red circle there, of these deaths are linked to positive gabapentin screens. So that's, we think, a notable amount. It's not by no means the majority of the story, but certainly is arguably part of the opioid overdose epidemic story that we've been focused on for many years now, and which has not been receding in the way that we had hoped, especially through COVID. There's data in the petition about diversion as well, and rates of diversion that have occurred. And this study in particular reveals that the diversion rates we saw in 2002 were pretty much not evident. As of 2015, they've become almost as evident, or even more so, in terms of signal per 100,000 of the population, presumably because of widespread use of gabapentin, than even oxycodone. So we do see diversion. There are pharmacovigilance studies. That is, these are passive studies where people can voluntarily report concerns they have about a medication that support concerns about the drug having the adverse effects of withdrawal symptoms, even hallucinations, or and euphoric mood or drug abuse symptoms or concerns that go along with the use of these drugs, both from European and from domestic sources. And survey data that suggests people use the drug because they want to get high or because they want to increase the effects of other drugs that they're abusing. In this case, I'm showing you data both from Massachusetts and from Florida. So the totality of the evidence, this is nearly my last slide, is that we think our petition demonstrates that there's a lot of data, especially observational data, only a few randomized trial data points, but lots of observational data that there's use, harm, diversion, and similarities to pregabalin already scheduled. These concerns, of course, especially strong with opioids. We think Schedule 5 is wholly appropriate, given the standard here that we're talking about is preponderance of the evidence. It's not a beyond the reasonable doubt standard. It's a preponderance of the evidence, or greater than 51% if you want a number, that there's a concern that should be regulated by the DEA. And we think it's a measured approach that's not a ban. It's aimed at reducing morbidity and mortality, quite frankly. Well, a couple of final notes, because many people have asked me in the wake of the proffering of the petition, will scheduling make a difference? This particular study, which we cite in the petition, I think is good real evidence, or what people would refer to as real world evidence, that scheduling can matter. It focused on Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, which scheduled the medication around 2017, and compared it to 10 states with similar opioid problems as a way to adjust for it, and did what one would refer to as sort of an interrupted time series analysis to see whether or not the intervention, that is scheduling locally in the state, mattered. The graph here shows that there is at least some bending of the curve in the direction that we would hope, that's related to scheduling of these drugs. And you can see at the top of the slide, Kentucky around in 2017 scheduled the drug, and West Virginia in 2018, and Tennessee in 2018 also scheduled the drug. And that blue line above refers to the rates per enrollee based on their Medicare Part D program, the rates per enrollee of day supply of gabapentin. You can see that curve starts to bend after 2017, after the scheduling of the drug. It doesn't happen in the 10 control states. Moreover, at the bottom of the curve, you see even states that used a prescription drug monitoring program approach, it didn't happen there. And states that had absolutely no regulation, it didn't happen there either. So this is, as I say, real world data, if you will, suggesting that scheduling, and presumably at the federal level, would have this kind of desired impact. So with that, I'll conclude, but I'll point out just at the top of this slide, I offer you a link and you can make comments on our petition. We encourage you to do that. You can leave documents there or put data there from your state. You can offer support or opposition to the petition, but it's now currently online for this kind of comment, and that's part of the process. So I thank you, and I welcome questions.
So one of the questions that somebody asked is, will the slides be made available, and the slides and the recording, and if you can pass along the slides to me. And there was actually one person who, and then I'll let Carrie wrap it up also if there are additional questions. So Stephanie Malcolm raised her hand, and I don't know if she wants to actually ask a question. I'm gonna click the little button, allow to talk. not to put her on the spot, but do you have a question, Stephanie? Okay, she said no, she might have accidentally hit it. I actually have, there was some comments about gabapentin as a #1 prescribed drug in controlled substance in Kentucky. Actually, one question I had, and if anybody else has anything, is how did you come about honing in on gabapentin? Like, how does your organization sort of choose what you're going to look at?
That's a good question. So, you know, it's so widely used, and there has been literature emerging suggesting a signal of concern. So, you know, and you know, some of this is quite in line with what the DEA should care about, right? And what they explicitly say that they do care about. So it's widely used off label. There are clear concerns related to human health and public health tied to it. Moreover, you know, the context of the opioid overdose epidemic and concerns about analgesic therapy broadly and its overuse has been part of the narrative, you know, part of the story here that brought it to our attention, because, you know, it's maybe as I showed there, pregabalin and gabapentin are Schedule 5 drugs. We're not talking a narcotic, an opioid per se, but they have opioid-like concerns, respiratory depression being key. The fact that people are self-administering and there's euphoria at higher doses, or suggestions of that from qualitative reports. Those are concerning and related as well. So all those things came together, and we thought it was reasonable to do this, to take this action.
Okay, and one last thing, Carrie, if you don't mind, I'm gonna try to share my screen because I did want to share a study that we recently did of our members as we're sort of wrapping up. We actually did a pulse check of our members, asking about whether it's a drug of concern in their state, whether they currently schedule it, and it's going to be posted on our website and blasted out. But I just wanted to quickly go through the results. If I can actually up there. As you can see, 64% indicated it's a drug of concern. 82% indicated that they do support the placement in a Schedule 5 drug, controlled substance, and 95% supported sending the results of the survey, as unscientific as it may be, but it is definitely a pulse check from the states, to FDA and DEA, which has already been done. So I just wanted to share that as a FYI to folks.
Excellent, Kathy. Dr. Abrams, thank you so much for sharing your insight and expertise. And I apologize to the group. We went a little bit over, but it was good information. So thank you again on behalf of the National Association of State Controlled Substance Authorities. I would like to thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar. We hope you find the information impactful. Just a few additional announcements. Keep an eye out for future webinars and the annual conference in Salt Lake City, October 24th through 27. And resolutions and bylaws committees want a reminder sent to you about getting anything in. Again, thank you to our sponsors for making today's webinar possible. And thank you for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, Dr. Abrams, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right.